So without further ado, I will now formally begin this evening's book launch. So it's our great pleasure to come together this evening to celebrate yet another book from our esteemed colleague here at London Metropolitan University, Professor Alistair Ross. And the title of the book, which you will have seen from your invitation, is Educational Research for Social Justice, Evidence and Practice. So this evening we're going to be hearing from Alistair and from several of his colleagues, as well as from the series editor, who will be saying a bit more about the series. I'll just briefly introduce Alistair. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Alistair and his body of work over many years. And then I'll hand over to Alistair, who will introduce a bit more about the book and his colleagues who will be speaking this evening. So Professor Alistair Ross is Senior Professor in Politics and Education here at London Metropolitan University. He has a PhD in Politics from the University of London and a DLit from London Metropolitan, and he is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. So Alistair, a very big congratulations on your book, and I'll now hand over to you to tell us more about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And can I thank you all for coming tonight to this book launch? And can I also thank the contributors to the volume who are all here today, some of whom will be speaking in a few minutes' time. Thanks also to Springer, our publishers in Germany, especially our editor, Astrid Nordemir, and to the production team in India. When this new series was first proposed by Yunus Ariman in 2016, I saw it as a valuable and significant opportunity to relate the public good with educational research, an examination of how political judgments are being made about the place and nature of research. And to put this in an international context, it would require analysing the interaction between the controllers of the national education systems and their research communities. And after Springer agreed to take the series on, we began in 2018 to put this volume together, a long and stimulating process, the conclusion of which we celebrate tonight. Education has an enormously important role in every state in the world. In every country, public education is seen as an important state function. It's very commonly assumed to have a role in reproducing the culture of a country, in underpinning the qualifications and expertise of the new generations of the workforce, and of structurally underpinning the country's economy, all of which assumptions must be challenged. So we've taken a very critical view of the way the UK's socio-political structures control and manage education and of the role of research into this. I'd like to focus on two particular aspects. Firstly, the dominant theory of meritocracy. Politicians, the public, seem committed to the idea of a meritocratic levelling up, and it's presented as a relatively recent concept, dating back to the early use of the word by Michael Young in his book, The Rise of the Meritocracy. Enormously popular in this paperback version, but very clearly also enormously not read. It's a satire. It's a work of academic fiction that even reading the title would suggest. Its subtitle is 1870 to 2033. And if you read the final footnote in the book, it's even clearer. The publishers regret the final chapter of the book has not been proofread by the author, who was killed in the great populist riots of 2033. It is a prophetic work of fiction and a warning, and certainly not a recipe for greater equality. Young argued that the meritocratic principle, if it took hold, as he feared it was going to happen in the early 1950s, it would be giving some people the opportunity to succeed, necessarily at the expense of the others, who would have to be branded as failures. An entrenched privileged class would grow, he predicted, who would ensure that their children disproportionately benefited from this system, succeeding their parents into positions of power. Far from ensuring equality, this would embed an elite. And politicians from Macmillan through Wilson, Thatcher and Blair to May have subscribed to this meritocratic principle. Schools and universities across the globe have taken on the role of sieving and classifying young people by a narrow band of educational values. Your child's success is only possible if other children fail. And Maren Hutchings' chapter in this volume captures the current operation of this process with some precision. And this is taking place on an international scale. The PISA studies show countries jostling to be ranked higher up the international league tables, often by tiny percentages of difference, distorting the meaning of education, its content, and its values. In the UK, our present politicians, curiously and rather obtusely, keep comparing the UK with the rankings of Far Eastern countries. Germany, rather more rationally, uses neighbouring Finland as a comparator. But Germany itself is subject to what one author calls regressive modernisation, where equality of opportunity legitimizes growing inequality. And this leads to the second point that our book underlines, that the idea of the public good is enormously difficult. Who should determine it? How? Certainly not by some Bentham calculus of the greatest good of the greatest number. Human beings are too diverse and too individual to assume that there's always a single best way to educate people. As a young teacher, I remember being taught that every method of teaching reading works with some individuals, but no single way will work with all individuals. And education must be for all. One despairs of research that promises to identify the best methods, all too often in response to political and media demands. The public good in these matters needs to be informed by more than counting heads. It needs the application of clear values and visions of social goals far wider than the national league tables and the admissions to Russell Group universities or a growth in the GDP. One of the problems of understanding education is that we've all been through it, and our leaders have been through it, and therefore they understand and believe the very fact that they've succeeded in becoming leaders means that their own education has been particularly successful and therefore should become the model for the whole community. But these leaders have often only been through a particularly narrow and elitist private educational process shared by only 7% of the UK population. But 45% of Conservative MPs, 17% of Labour MPs, 57% of the House of Lords, 59% of permanent secretaries in the civil service, 40% of national news editors and journalists and commentators have all been privately educated. And they feel that their educational experiences privilege them to define the educational process of the 93% of young people who attend state schools. Over the past 40 years, half of the Conservative ministers of education and half of the Labour ministers of education have been privately educated. Both meritocracy and a misplaced understanding of the public good are profound political issues which directly influence any conception of what social justice might mean in education. And in this book, we've tried to show how researchers can try to grapple with this, interacting with policymakers and sometimes with practitioners to challenge their preconceptions and to think in terms of greater social inclusion and equitable outcomes rather than the equal opportunities. So our chapter contributors are some of a group of 40 researchers who work together here at London Met over 15 years. And we don't pretend to have the answers, but we do all know that equality in education is not a simple concept, but one that's constantly developing and changing. It's not a matter of trite observations about equality of opportunity or levelling up or culture wars, but a fundamental struggle to ensure that education stops continuing to reproduce past mores and half-remembered and a quarter understood cultures and becomes radically different and inclusive. And it is possible to include inclusion in many of the commissioned research projects. So that's what we've tried to do, and I'd like to introduce three of our contributing authors. First of all, Carol Leithwood, formerly an emeritus professor at London University and Metropolitan University, and now who has retired. So over to Carol. Carol, are you there?
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Oh, good, good. Thank you. Okay, so I've been asked to briefly reflect on social justice and the public good in relation to chapter 13, which draws on a 2009 European Commission funded study of educational policies and programmes that were designed to address educational inequalities across 14 EU states. And the study involved a partnership of 7 universities from 7 different EU nations. In the study, we analysed almost 300 policies and programmes, highlighting both successes and limitations, and coming up with a series of principles for action in relation to educational intervention projects, which were aimed to enhance social justice and the public good. For example, involving disadvantaged communities directly in the planning, management, and evaluation of programmes aimed at them. We didn't find lots of examples of that, so that was one thing we suggested needed to happen. And, for example, directing programmes at the wider population and community, not simply at the disadvantaged group, so that the disadvantaged aren't put on the spot and othered and so on, and others let off the hook around the change that needs to happen. But reflecting on the 2009 study for this chapter, we went on to examine what had happened since then. Firstly, in 4 specific areas of inequality, which included socioeconomic, ethnicity, education of migrants, and gender. And then we explored changes in 3 of the countries that were part of the original study, and that's Greece, Sweden, and the UK. That analysis highlighted the importance of global events, for example, the financial crisis of 2008-9, the dominance of neoliberal policy discourses, and the specific discourses, policies, and practices of national governments, in the extent to which achievements noted in 2009 were sustained, and whether educational inequalities could be seen to have increased or decreased. In Greece, for example, which suffered tremendous financial, economic issues following the financial crisis, the priority became on efficiency rather than equity, because there simply wasn't the funding as well to contribute that much to educational equity programs. In Sweden, segregation of housing and schooling continued to exacerbate inequalities in educational outcomes. And in the UK, austerity policies of the Conservative Lib Dem coalition from 2010 not only decimated many of the previously successful initiatives, such as Sure Start, but racist discourses from politicians, the hostile environment of the Home Office, and Brexit resulted in an increase in racial harassment in educational institutions and in wider society. And those are just a few examples. What the analysis also demonstrated was the problem of short-termism that we saw in relation to programmes and policies examined in the original study. Change doesn't happen overnight, and beneficial outcomes need to be sustained over time. Of course, in each of these 3 countries, there have been continued to be specific policies and programmes aimed to address educational disadvantage. But for these to begin to challenge educational inequalities of outcome and further social justice and the public good, the focus needs to be on equity rather than efficiency, and sadly too often it's efficiency. It needs to be longer than short rather than short term, and with an acknowledgement of intersectionality and multiple forms of inequality. We need to recognise institutional education inequalities in the broadest sense. So not only, for example, a project in terms of raising specific qualifications for particular groups, but also paying attention to students' experience in education institutions of inclusion or of exclusion, their sense of belonging, the racism, sexism, and other forms of harassment and discrimination that many continue to experience, and the effective inequalities that Kathleen Lynch so eloquently articulates. And if policymakers are really serious about wanting to tackle disadvantage, as so many of them in these 3 countries and across Europe say they are, then there also needs to be the political will to address the wider social, economic, and cultural inequalities that continue to undermine social justice and the public good. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Now I'd like to introduce Jane Osgood. Jane is a professor at Middlesex University. Jane, can you come in?
I'm trying to. Am I here?
We can hear you.
You can't see me. Let me
can't see you yet. You need to put the camera on.
Does that work?
Yeah, you're working there. You're there. Hi, Jane.
And I have some slides. I don't know. I'm not familiar with this platform, so it's all a bit. How do I show my slides? I don't necessarily need to. Here we go. Okay, so yeah, thanks for that introduction, Alistair, and it's really great to virtually be back at London Met, but not quite. So yeah, through my work broadly, I seek to foreground a concern with social justice through critical engagements with early childhood policy, curricular frameworks and pedagogical approaches. And my aim has always been and continues to be to extend understandings of the workforce, families, the childhood and early years context through research framed by critical so post-structuralist, post-humanist, post-qualitative approaches. And I feel I owe a great deal to the community here tonight. I worked at the Institute for Policy Studies in Education at London Metropolitan for 13 years. And during that time, I learnt so much from scholars equally impassioned as myself about trying to make a difference in the world through our research. So I was delighted to be invited to be part of this book project, but I had massively underestimated what a task condensing over a decade of research into one chapter would be, and now condensing that one chapter into 5 minutes. Alistair always was quite the taskmaster, but I shall attempt to do that. So we often hear the saying, give me a child until he is 7 and I will show you the man. And it signals something of the way in which early childhood is understood as some form of preparation for a later, more significant, more important and more valued stage of life to come. And all the time that early childhood as a life stage is viewed as a precursor to something bigger, and all the time that early childhood is generally underestimated, so too will its workforce. And this has been a preoccupation to many researching the field of early childhood, myself included, who want to argue for another conceptualization of the child and hence argue for the importance of the early childhood workforce to the lives of very young children and to the public good more generally. So the early childhood education workforce has been presented for a good long while now as being of poor quality and therefore in need of major reform. And this has gone on for several decades. And so despite endless policies, interventions and reforms, the prevailing narrative remains the same, that we have this crisis in early childhood education. And policy has stated that key to raising quality in early childhood education must be shaped by standardization, transparency and accountability, which are to be achieved through quality assurance measures, curriculum framework and inspection regimes. So the persistent need to raise quality through heightened professionalism has been framed in particular ways through dominant discourses and rest upon a socially constructed perennial crisis in the early years, which provides the justification for this endless tinkering with the workforce. And there are twin concepts within these discourses, which are quality and professionalism. And the logic follows that quality relies upon a well-qualified and professional workforce, but this linear and rational logic has been extensively troubled, and quality is a very contentious concept which remains largely contested. So during my time at IPSI, I invested years in undertaking critical discourse analysis of policy and found that for a highly gendered, underpaid and undervalued workforce, the rescue from neglect that policy discourses promised was seductive. For members of that workforce, finding themselves centre stage in policy terms, coupled with the rate and pace of reform to their working practices, effectively diverts attention from the fact that they're conforming to a narrow version of professionalism. And that version values technical competence over critical reflection. This is a very similar debate that rages in statutory school age teaching as well. So it was only through excavating and dismantling policy texts through a social justice lens that it becomes evident how policy discourses work in subtle yet powerful ways to confer particular subjectivities upon members of an already marginalised workforce. So whilst critical policy analysis has much to tell us, I felt it was imperative to create opportunities to hear stories from those on the front line of nurseries, not the managers, not the leaders, not the owners, but the front line rank and file women who make up the workforce. So in 2003, I set out to explore nursery worker constructions of being professional and doing professionalism, which ultimately found its way into this 2012 monograph. And I was specifically concerned to examine the ways in which nursery workers negotiate the intersection of a professional identity from their classed, gendered, raced identities. So for me, it was important to compare and contrast the ways that these public discourses position nursery workers and to examine the extent to which practitioners resist them and draw upon them in various ways to negotiate their sense of self and sense of professionalism. So the ultimate aim of the study was to present an alternative account to that offered and sustained through hegemonic public discourses. So in addition to this monograph, I authored probably around about a dozen publications with many colleagues in IPSI that sought to identify and trouble the means by which social injustices are created and sustained in the workforce. So it was by unearthing and challenging the significant implications of these hegemonic framings of professionalism that are typically based on white, middle-class, normative ideas about what professionalism should be for a principally working class and predominantly female workforce. So the overriding objective was to unsettle received wisdom and to provide the foundation for a workforce to agitate and resist. So it was very much a political project. And I think this is what the book collectively argues for, is the importance of research that can make a worldly difference. So it was very, okay, I'm probably running out of time. So my more recent research has not given up on the importance of critique, but I am trying to work in ways that bring critique and creativity together in a search for ways to go beyond merely critiquing, which is vital and important, but to engage in storytelling, so to work with those frontline rank and file workers and those communities to hear accounts and generate stories with them from within the community about what else it might be possible to learn about professionalism in early childhood if we go beyond a preoccupation with only the policy discourses. And so think about professionalism as more than exclusively concerned with human subjectivities. It's about community, spaces, places, geographies, emotions, affects, materiality. And this theoretical framing allows a consideration of how else ideas about professionalism come about. And wonder creates opportunities for wonder about what might happen if space is made for other stories about professionalism to find expression. So in many senses, it's about taking embodied encounters with affect and materiality seriously so that possibilities to think again about professionalism are produced. Apologies for this slide. If anybody's desperate to know what it says, I can tell you afterwards. But suffice to say, a feminist new materialist mode of researching, practicing and theorizing privileges creative experimentation over critique, but it does not abandon commitments to interrogating power and inequity, which is what this book collectively does so well. It's the practice of bringing critique and creativity together that holds generative potential to extend ideas and debates. We need ways, multiple ways, to avoid getting stuck in familiar ways of thinking and doing. So this is the transformative potential of research that's framed by a social justice agenda. So to conclude, what's remained constant in my work is a drive to expose social injustices by dismantling and critiquing taken for granted ideas. It's by taking apart ideas about quality and professionalism, for example, that it's possible to recognise the power of discourses to position people, indeed in this case an entire workforce, in particular ways. The next crucial step, I would argue, is to make use of that critique to then pursue possibilities to reshape pedagogical practices and research practices. So to my mind, it's by bringing critique and creativity together in generative ways, working directly with communities, that debates about the public good in education continue to flourish and can make some sort of tangible difference in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And I'd finally like to introduce our last speaker from the contributors, Barbara Reid, who is reader at University of Glasgow. Barbara, can you come in? You can.
Hello.
Hi, Barbara.
Can you see me, hear me, everything?
We can.
Great.
We can.
I'm also a bit confused by this non-Zoom thing, but I'll press on. So yeah, I just wanted to say as well, big hello to everybody, the past co-workers at IPSI especially. I wish we could all be together to celebrate this, but thank you so much to Alistair, to Merrin, to everyone who has organised this book, and it's a lovely thing that we got this together. I'm just going to speak a couple of minutes in relation to one of the chapters in the book, which is was authored by Carol Leithwood and myself, and it's on the topic of gender and educational knowledges. And in the chapter, we revisit work that we conducted collaboratively over the last decade, really, which was looking at the theme of gender and knowledge, particularly in higher education, and the implications for equity in higher education. And back in 2009, just after I had left IPSI, actually, Carol and I wrote a book called Gender and the Changing Face of Higher Education, A Feminized Future. And that took a critical look at the argument that an increased enrollment of women students in HE meant that the sector could now be seen as feminized. And we argued in that book that in terms of gender, a masculinized conception of knowledge has been and arguably remains more dominant within the academy, despite numerical changes that have instigated somewhat of a panic in some circles around this idea of feminization, which also seems to imply a devaluing. And a key aspect of the book was not only arguing against this notion of feminization, but also arguing against the prevalent conception that the academy, the sort of knowledge from the university, is a place of neutral, disinterested knowledge production and dissemination. But instead, what we did in the book and in all our work together was look at the ways in which the university as an institution and the knowledge that's produced and circulated at university has always been and remains very complexly gendered, raced and classed. And I won't go through all the points in our chapter, I'll just be here for a couple of minutes. But I just wanted to touch briefly on one aspect that we talk about, which is the rise of populist anti-intellectual rhetoric in Europe and the US and further afield. Sorry, and also in tandem with more long-standing attacks on the university by many governments and political movements around the globe. Now, Norris and Inglehart and others have argued how the rise of such attacks in many global north countries especially can be seen as part of a backlash against civil rights and other gains by equality movements. And in the guise of standing up for free speech, activists and academics on the left are characterized as intolerant snowflakes who are supposedly politically biased and therefore too strident and aggressive for the academy. But such arguments can often then cloak themselves in the discourse of academic knowledge as traditionally neutral and disinterested from political pursuits. And that sort of neutral disinterest is then opposed to the left's seemingly biased subjective identity politics. So therefore, as academics, arguably, we have a double task: to critique notions that the so-called pendulum has swung the other way and that there's too much focus on anti-racist and anti-sexist curricula and pedagogy. So we have to critique that, but we also have to make sure to critique the myth that there ever was some kind of completely neutral, value-free academy that we could or should move back to, as it is exactly this rhetoric that is then used to undermine the academic freedom of alternative perspectives. So just to finish up, our aim in the chapter has been to contribute to discussions in the volume overall that problematizes the notion of the university and other aspects of education and educational knowledge as always an uncritical universal public good. Beyond the surface statistics of women undergraduates supposedly taking over the university, just what can be considered valid knowledge and who are considered to be valid, legitimate and appropriate knowers continues to be a site of ongoing contestation and struggle. And I'll leave it there, but I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the talks. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Barbara. And I'm now going to hand over back to Louise, who's going to chair the rest of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you very much to those three contributors. So it's back to me now, Louise Ryan, and I'm going to chair the rest of the event. So just to flag up that we're now going to have three speakers who will each speak for 10 minutes, and I will be keeping a very close eye on time because I'm very keen that we allow as much time as possible for discussion. I found listening to those three chapter contributors really, really enlightening, and I was very struck by what Barbara was just saying in her closing remarks about anti-intellectual discourse. I don't think I'll ever get over Michael Gove's Brexit mantra of we've had enough of experts. I mean, if ever there was a kind of rampant intellectual discourse, you need look no further than Michael Gove's Brexit stance. But particularly now, this kind of critique of freedom of speech, this whole guise of freedom of speech being really used as a stick to beat academics. So there's so many powerful things there, and I really look forward to the discussion later. But now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is, as you can see there, Professor Mustafa Yunus from the university, Mart University in Turkey. And he's professor at the Institute of International he was professor at the Institute of International Comparative and Intercultural Education in the University of Hamburg. He's also an honorary research fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Education at London Metropolitan University. And he is the series editor for Education, Science, Evidence and the Public Good. And he's currently the president of the World Education Research Association. So, Yunus, we're very honored that you've joined us here this evening, and we look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You're
Excellent.
A little bit quiet, but we can hear you.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to speak with you virtually today at this book launch. I would like to thank Louise Ryan for hosting the book launch and inviting me to give a speech at the event. Can you hear me?
Sorry, Yunus, is it possible for you to increase your volume? You're very, very quiet.
Okay, let me.
Can you raise the volume or maybe just get a little bit closer to your microphone?
How is it now?
We can see you perfectly, but the sound is very low.
Is it better now or?
A little bit.
Let me try this way. Is it better now? Is it better now? Can you hear me now?
It's a bit better.
Oh, okay. It seems there's a technical issue. I don't know. Now, can you hear me better now?
Yes. If you,
okay.
Speak now. That's fine. Yeah, it's much better.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor for me to speak with you virtually today at this book launch. I would like to thank Louise Ryan for hosting the book launch and inviting me to give a speech at this event. Educational Research for Social Justice, Evidence and Practice from the UK is the first volume in the Vera Springer book series. I would like to congratulate Alistair Rose and the chapter contributors for their hard work and dedication to publish this timely and important work. I also would like to thank friends and colleagues who have supported our editing endeavor. I would like to give special thanks to the co-editors of the book series, Ingrid Gogolin, Barbara Schneider, and Felice Levine, for their excellent work reviewing the contributions and assisting the volume editor and chapter contributors with their recommendations. Producing an edited volume is a substantial amount of work. I'm thanking especially the Bertrand Burus, Martina Riedler, Joanna Lunardi Mendes, and Raul Morales for their helpful remarks. And now I would like to give you a brief information about the Vera Springer book series entitled Education Science, Evidence and the Public Good. This book series takes an analytical perspective on the theoretical underpinnings and practical examples of use of scientific evidence to inform educational policy and practice in an international context. The book series ties in with current debates about the purpose and the form of education in the era of post-truth, rapid technological change, globalization, demographic and political shifts, and growing economic inequalities, with the contributions from national and international educational research associations, organizations, institutions. This series aims to ask, what have we learned from the use of science as evidence in educational policy, research, and practice that can support democratic, humanistic, morally responsible development for individuals and societies in different regional and international contexts. Each book in the series will demonstrate how the discourses and practices of scientific inquiry and evidence in education have evolved by providing empirical case examples and best practices of evidence use. The following questions will guide each book in the series. What constitutes scientific evidence and public good? How are evidence and scientific inquiry and the public good defined in different regional and international contexts? What ongoing and historical conversations and discourses on using science as evidence in the field of education already exist? What are the past successes and failures of using scientific evidence in education for the sake of public good, as well as current work and future possibilities? How does scientific evidence and research serve the public good in educational policy and practice at regional and global levels? What are the case examples and best practices of use of science as evidence to serve the public good? And what kind of role should national educational research associations and international educational research institutions and organizations play in generating and distributing scientific evidence to serve the public good? World Educational Research Association would like to invite you to submit proposals for the book series. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions regarding the proposal submission process. Now I would like to explain our motivation to publish Vera book series on education science, evidence to serve the public good. Science as it stands today faces a crisis of public and political trust, combined with an inner critique of standards of quality and integrity. The denial of science is not new, but in today's world, academic studies appear to be increasingly threatened by the widespread dissemination of misleading, ideologically driven and biased information. Furthermore, education and social science have either undergone or are under pressure to adopt the policies based on neoliberal economic indicators, such as efficiency, standardization, testing, and accountability. Some of the challenges educational institutions face today include the closing of teacher education programs at higher education institutions, proliferation of test-based evaluation, standardization of curriculum and assessment, the unidirectional push for the marketization of educational programs, and budget cuts for the funding of education and social science research. Arguably, the social and educational science have ever been under greater pressure than today. In March 2014, together with 4 social science humanities associations, European Educational Research Association sent a letter to the European Commissioner to indicate their concern with the low budget for social science and humanities in Horizon 2020 work program. In another statement, the Executive Committee of the European Educational Research Association criticized European policymakers for not mentioning social science and humanities or educational research as challenges in the European 2020 document and the draft of Horizon 2020. A similar policy development occurred in Japan recently. In 2015, Hakuban Hishimomura, the Minister of Education in Japan, sent a letter to all of 86 national universities in the country to call them to take active steps to abolish social science and humanities organizations or to convert them to serve areas that better meets the society's needs. 26 universities out of 60 national universities which offer courses in these programs have confirmed that they will either close or scale back their social science and humanities faculties as a response to the directive of the Japanese government. In Australia, Graham and Buckley demonstrated that the proportion of national research funding spent on education tragically small. Educational researchers were the recipients of the 1.3% of the entire funding pool. 4 major government policies in the United States: the Improving America's School Act of 1994, the Goals 2000, Educate American Act, No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, and Every Student Succeed Act in 2015 were fueled by a new neoliberal interest in maintaining US economic competitiveness in the world. When the No Child Left Behind became the law in 2002 as the federal government's biggest intervention in education history in the country, it promised to grow financial and educational productivity in an increased globalized economy, to increase the objectivity in evaluation and assessment, and to reduce educational inequality. Even though research institutions and policy circles are losing ground against a discourse that considers education as a commodity, there is a growing interest among educational non-governmental organizations and research circles in understanding and reframing education and educational research as public good that signifies a common commitment to social justice and democratic equality, involves complex and moral political judgments regarding what constitutes good for the polity as a whole. For example, in its mission statement, American Educational Research Association identifies the promotion of the use of research to serve public good as the fundamental responsibility of the association. In order to accomplish this task, AERA provides scientific evidence on the benefits of diversity and affirmative action in legal briefs submitted to the Supreme Court, holds Capitol Hill briefings on research issues of importance to the public and policymakers, and issues research-based positions on education issues of public concern. The Australian Association for Research in Education identifies its vision as to enhance the public good by promoting, supporting, and improving research and scholarship in education to generate high-quality educational research. British Educational Research Association is another non-governmental organization committed to working for the public good by sustaining a strong and high-quality educational research community dedicated to the advancing knowledge of education. The lobbying effort of the European Educational Research Association to influence the policymakers in the European Commission in order to make education and social science research more visible in Horizon 2020 work program is another important example of serving public good by promoting educational research. The editorial board of the Vera book series argues that the educational research should join the political and public, not just the academic discourse, about the role of educational research in society, about how research evidence is both implicated in and confronts the politics of what counts as knowledge. As Schwant indicated, researchers should ask following questions as guiding principles. Who does an educational science serve and how? Who stands to gain and who to lose from the appeal to disregard of scientific findings? How is a science of education implicated in political agenda? Under what circumstances is an endorsement of education science a simultaneous expression of disrespect for difference and diversity in perspective and understanding? We hope that Vera book series will enable educational researchers and research communities to speak up when scientific findings are ignored by those in power or threatened as mere matters of ideological beliefs. We, as the editor of the book series, will keep reminding public and policymakers of the importance of the social mission of educational research, to provide the best scientific evidence possible as the basis for public policy to serve public good. I would like to thank Alistair Rose and chapter contributors for joining us in this important endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eunice, for keeping very, very much to time. So I really
Thank you
appreciate
very
that.
much.
And you've raised some really important and very shocking issues. I was unaware of that issue. A really powerful example. So the next speaker is Professor Paul Downs from Dublin. So Paul, we've met before. It's great to see you again. So Paul is Associate Professor of Psychology of Education and Director of the Educational Disadvantage Centre at Dublin City University, Ireland. And he's a member of various expert advisory groups in the European Commission and has published extensively. His recent books include Concentric Space as a Life Principle Beyond Schopenhauer in 2019, and Reconstructing Agency in Developmental and Educational Psychology in 2020, both published with Routledge. Paul, you have 10 minutes. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Can you hear me okay? Clear
Yes,
enough?
can hear you, yeah. And we can
Great.
see your slides as well.
Great. Thank you. So social justice is an elastic concept that can be stretched in many directions. I think the book being launched today offers a power interdisciplinary synthesis across sociology, politics, economics, and philosophy in relation to social justice and education. The focus of my presentation today is going to look at other bridges, with other lenses within which to read your book, edited by Alistair. So I'm going to look at this through three particular angles as part of this argument for an extension of the horizons of social justice research in education. The first part of my presentation is going to emphasize that educational research in social justice, your book is ripe for spatial readings and to argue for a spatial turn in social justice and education research. I'm then going to examine the interplay between the social justice discourse and systems of care, building on conceptions of the concrete other, and also our own EU Commission work that's related to this theme. And then I'm going to move on to a more explicit human rights focus as the third element of my presentation. So I'm arguing here that exclusion and inclusion are often overlooked as being spatial concepts, and that space is a very fundamental dimension of experience, arguably prior even to language. And that diametric space is something which is, obviously we're familiar with binary opposites, but this is also a spatial conception, whether it's of the us, them, othering conceptions, the competition themes of winner versus loser, or diametric spatial oppositions of hierarchy, of above and below. At times, I could see some of the chapters drew on Foucault's divide spaces in your book that was being launched. And just to also emphasize that early Foucault did seek to develop a concept of a fundamental structure of exclusion in debate with Derrida that Derrida would have strongly critiqued at the time. So my argument here is that to conceive of our education systems as diametric spatial systems and to interrogate potential shifts towards more concentric relational spatial systems of assumed connection. This also builds on Ferreira and Michael Apple's work regarding the need to see spatial process in education. We need not only new spatial theories, but also new methodological tools to think spatially. So as you can see throughout many of the chapters in the book today, that you can see that these diametric oppositions are a pervasive theme. Suspension and off-rolling in the interest of the school rather than the student was emphasized by in Hutchings' chapter. And failure labels, this success-failure diametric opposition, something also that both Hutchings and Alistair Ross's chapter discussed about as Alistair mentioned earlier, the kind of meritocratic culture and discourse is a system of diametric space. The winner-loser diametric oppositions is something requiring not only deconstruction, but reconstruction. Fretwell's chapter discusses the hard to reach. Again, this is very much a kind of critique of these diametric spatial dimensions imbued in our systems, the norm versus the problematic other, winners and losers. McCallum's chapter, critique dichotomy, false dichotomies of creativity versus basic literacy skills. Again, a diametric spatial projection. Minty's chapter on cultural distance in higher education resonates also with the late Peter Jarvis's term of disjuncture of people's experiences in higher education. Is again a diametric space of assumed separation between whether self and other or in terms of engagements with the culture. Ross's later chapter discusses young people's categorization of self and other to seek identities that go beyond the assumed separations that I argue are a spatial concept that's very much in diametric terms for cases. Moving on then to the second key theme here, which is to interrogate and raise the question about the interplay between social justice discourse and care discourse. Obviously, we're all familiar with Carol Gilligan's work and Sela Benaviv's work, emphasizing the concrete other rather than the abstract other, and how that interplay between care and systems of care in particular and social justice is going to play out in the future. And I draw also here on the shift in criminology from left idealism towards left realism that Jock Young would have instigated in the 1980s. That very much the notion was that working class communities were very much victims of crime, and their lived experience had to be engaged with. So a left realist tradition here may emphasize lived realities of hunger, sleep, mental health strains, substance abuse, discrimination, bullying, suspension, gangland issues, fear of failure, authoritarian teaching, and all of these at European level, perhaps with the exception of gangland issues, have been addressed or being sought to be addressed at EU Commission level under the rubric of a headline target for ET 2020 and also new ET 2030 targets focusing on reduction of early school leaving. Alistair Ross's chapter draws heavily on Rawls and including critique of Rawls, and just again, of course, that Rawls's veil of ignorance is very much criticized as an abstract other way of engaging with social contract, and a shift towards concrete other, the lived experience of concrete groups, is, I think, really key for future horizons in social justice and systems of care in education research. So also the issue of complexity in systems of care for complexity draws in issues of multidisciplinary teams in and around schools, and bridges between health and education as a social justice issue. And our own work with Professor Anna Edwards for the European Commission has interrogated some of those bridges that we need, particularly with a focus on early school leaving prevention. Our own evaluation of the implementation of the EU Council recommendation in 35 countries again tries to focus on complexity, on concrete named groups, the concrete other, and phenomenology as to interrogate their lived experiences. So these can be groups including newly arrived migrants of all ages, young men, learners of different age groups, those living in rural or deprived areas with mental health issues, trauma issues, and complex needs of particular concrete other groups, such as children with mental health issues, children in the care system, children with parents in prison, victims of domestic violence. Most of these issues are hugely neglected at a European level across European member states. So the concern there is to build an engagement with complexity, as both Mentor and Ross amplify in their chapters, but also with the mental health dimension that Hutchings' chapter would have drawn. And my final strand of argument here is to argue for an acceleration of focus on the human rights dimensions to a social justice narrative and discourse. And I think here, there's well-recognized criticisms of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Aoife Nolan's work has highlighted how this is very weak on poverty-related dimensions. I would emphasize here that there is a lot of potential in the UN right to the highest attainable standard of health, and that there are key dimensions of that we've been trying to develop for educational systems. Just to note also, I think the book, as a kind of observation in passing, is that the book we launched today is very much actually more resonant with the continental legal traditions of abstract deductive principles, more than perhaps even the common law precedents that we would associate more with British contexts, based on inductive reasoning through concrete cases. I think there's a need for an interplay of both dimensions in social justice and education research. So just to note, in terms of the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, it's very much committed to issues of the active informed participation of individuals and communities in policy decisions that affect them. So these are legal strategies at international law level that I think are ripe for development in the social justice discourse. Again, notions such as formulation, implementation and monitoring of health strategies that are also directly relevant to education context too, and that this is a call for participatory policy making for local community level and vulnerable groups, including minorities. So I think it is a useful framework for future development. And I'll just also finish just on a point about the tension between a science discourse and the post-structuralist discourse that's in the book being launched today. I think it's a creative interplay, a dialectical interplay. I was very taken by Moreau's chapter on the framing of the masculinization of teaching profession, and that this is and her critique of this as in terms of gynophobia. I think this is a very important point, that the framing of issues is an ideology, but I think that's already been somewhat recognized in scientific discourse. So, for example, already from Popper, Lactatu's Feyerabend, the philosophy of science narratives very much do recognize the theory-ladenness in observation. So there is the big question about how do we reconcile, empirical commitments with, I think the phrase that was used earlier, the commitment to unsettle received wisdom through deconstructing ideologies. So from a policy perspective, how do we become policy relevant there? And of course, the social justice discourse brings up normative claims that may be in tension with with science as well, even going back to Hume's induction principles that recognize that ought cannot be derived from is. Just to note, finally, that our own international research network on equity in youth education and training is trying to build these interdisciplinary bridges. So we need to bring together not only sociology, politics, economics, and philosophy in social justice education, but to try to integrate those with psychology, law, geography, health promotion in social justice education as part of a fruitful dialogue. Not necessarily for consensus, but at least for debate. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. So we now move to our final speakers, who will do a double act. Before they start their 10 minutes and before I introduce them, just to say that we will then open the floor for questions after the next contributors. You can either type your questions in the chat, or you can put your hand up and ask your questions as you prefer. So I'll just now introduce our final two speakers. So it's Professor Jan Bamford, who is Professor of International Higher Education and co-director of the Higher Education Research Group here at London Metropolitan University. She's co-authored Cultural Journeys in Higher Education, Student Voices and Narratives, which was published in 2019. And she is currently working on a new book, which will be published by Routledge in 2022. On the subject of improving student experience in the role of third space professionals. And the co-speaker with Jan this evening will be Professor Digby Warren, who is head of the Centre for Professional and Educational Development and also co-director of the Higher Education Research Centre here at London Metropolitan. And he has published widely and worked on many European projects over the years. And he is currently co-editor and co-author of Enhancing Teaching Practice in Higher Education, which will be published by Sage in 2021. So Jan and Digby, you have 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. No, Digby, you go first.
Right, super. So it's a great honor and indeed a pleasure to be speaking at this event and to be joining our esteemed colleagues, Professor Alistair Ross and former colleagues of IPSI. Thank you very much for the opportunity. what Jan and I would like to do in our slot is to make connections between social justice, education, research, educational practice, and higher education, and trying to weave those all together. We're going to be doing it by looking at what's currently happening through our higher education research group here at London Met. I'm going to probably be looking at it from a kind of a staff angle, and Jan will probably emphasize more the research that's happening from looking at student experience. So I thought it would be useful just to start off by coming back to this kind of key concept, which is, what do we mean by education for social justice? And as Brendan and Naidu observed in their publication in 2008, social justice is often trotted out as what they called a feel-good, a mantra that has a feel-good flavor that can cover up an absence of precise meaning, and in fact, put a gloss perhaps on institutional missions and strategies. And it would be good to interrogate that a little bit, even more so because of our sense of the notion of social justice in higher education and education broadly is being confronted, some would say even subverted, by the neoliberal agenda. And a really good example of this was being provided by Joanna Williams in her paper looking at changing concepts of public good in higher education, where she referenced the surprising, perhaps ironic, or perhaps less surprisingly, shift that happened under the Labour government in its last policy on higher education, where it was a document called Higher Ambitions, published in 2009, where, while on the one hand, recognizing that research and learning at university have an intrinsic value, they also spoke about access to higher education as being also a question of social mobility and important for meeting the economy's needs for high skills. And so we already see there that increasing shift that has happened over the last decade towards the commodification, marketization of higher education. And that in that context, we really do need to be quite mindful about what do we really mean by education for social justice. And looking at Alistair's introductory chapter to the book, my sense was that it's to do with education aimed at countering what Alistair summed up as the inequalities between treatment and outcomes of different social groups. And there have been other attempts to articulate education for social justice. Some have drawn on the feminist philosopher Nancy Fraser's three-dimensional theory of social justice and applied it to education. So in her model, she conceives of social justice as involving redistribution, recognition, and representation. And an example of how this has been applied to education is in the work of Courtney Carsden, who was a scholar at Harvard, and who made, translated redistribution in terms of improving access to education, recognition in terms of adopting a more inclusive kind of education, which involved overcoming the subordination of identities and attending to the quality of student-staff relationships and how those can foster equity and achievement, and representation in relation to looking at the question of partnership in decision making. And in our context, we're seeing an increasing shift to the idea of students as partners in higher education. And then there have been the views that have drawn on the capabilities approach or concept of human development articulated by Amrita Sen and Martin Nussbaum, where the idea here that it is about actually thinking about the ability of individuals to achieve well-being. It's not just a matter of essential human rights. It's about how individuals are able to actualize that through the ability to, as they put it, to be and to do what they have reason to value being and doing through equitable opportunities in higher education. But lest that sounds an individualistic perspective, it's really important to connect it again to the idea of public good and common good, as Nugent and Melanie Walker have done, by saying that it's also about how we can think of higher education as enabling the formation of agency commitments to advance the common good. And that's a really interesting angle, because that really links directly to London Metropolitan's new Education for Social Justice framework, which is, if you like, our kind of expanded, updated vision for an inclusive curriculum, but more than that, an inclusive university. As you can perhaps see, I apologize, the diagram is a little bit small, but there are 6 dimensions to the framework, covering accessibility, relationships and the psychosocial environment, inclusive assessment, developing the inclusive leadership attributes of our students, enabling opportunities that engage with student identity, personalization of learning and reflection, all underpinned by the application of critical theory and critical pedagogy. And this framework in itself is both research informed, drawing on research within the higher education sector, such as the seminal work by Montfort-Zinders looking at the causes of differential student attainment, but also drawing on some of the best practice externally, institutions like Kingston, UCL, De Montfort, Greenwich, Hertfordshire, and so on, who made significant developments in inclusive curricula to overcome the awarding gap which we're seeing in HE between white and so-called BAME students, and also building on some of the good practice and research here at London Met. So this was really developed by a working group of staff and students, drawing on both research and practice. And I suppose the spirit of it is summed up in this quotation about our framework, which is: we believe our curricula and practice must align with principles of equity and who our students are and the challenges facing London and its communities. And that focus on inclusive leadership is about how we are trying to equip our students to go out and be agents of social change. And I think what is also important to note, and here we are now starting to make the connection with research, is that there's a strong resonance already between this framework and the values and the practices of teaching staff at London Met. And this is in spite of the kind of prevailing context of neoliberalism. And this is based on research I undertook in 2017, indeed, based on a survey of staff about what values influence and underpin their curriculum and educational practice. And what stood out from that research was that a lot of the values held by staff, held dear by staff, in fact, what commits staff to the institution, are really mirrored in our Education for Social Justice framework. Values such as inclusivity, respect, facilitating student engagement, and the idea of social justice, which those who took part in the survey articulated around concepts such as advancing democratic values or adopting emancipatory pedagogies, which help students to negotiate and to navigate their own path of success and to empower marginalized groups. So I'm going to hand over now to Jan to talk a little bit more about the research happening through our research group contributing to this. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to be really quick because I know Louise has told us we've got 1 minute left. So I wasn't
really sure if that was for me or for both of us.
So I'll be really quick. So Digby and I set up the Higher Education Research Group and Alistair talks about this, the essential, the gap between educational research and policy and practice, and we've engaged and encouraged a number of projects which have tried to address this gap, principally because I felt that as an education researcher, we all too often forget the impact of policy on the individuals that are undergoing the changes that we introduced. And so I've very much been inspired by aspects of students' personal growth and individuals' personal growth, but also just connecting with what Paul was said by Ben Habib and the importance of culture in contemporary society. And working in an institution like London Met for so many years, I think understanding the multiplicity of conflicting narratives and practices and being attentive to repositioning and positioning is hugely important and informs everything we do. And so that's an underpinning ethos for HERG. So I just there's slides there so you can see a number of projects that we're working on, which endeavour to allow students to engage both with the creative processes that we're introducing as co-designers and participants in research processes, but also to give voice to their experience. And so the book was very much allowing students to voice their experience of some of the things that are really highlighted in Alistair's book and the associated chapters in the book, so that we can understand more about what we need to do to change policy and practice, both within London Met and further afield. And these are kinds of some of the themes that arise: complexities, cultural identities, resilience, belonging, and dissonance as well. And some of the things that we have tried to address with our research in terms of cultivating the individual. And I think I'll leave it there because I don't want to go over time for Louise, but obviously if people have questions, we can explore those issues more in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Sorry for cutting you off, but I'm just very conscious of time, and I'm very keen to open up the floor to discussion. So thanks, Jan and Digby. So we've now got about 15 minutes left. And as I said, if you've got questions, please type your questions in the chat, or if you prefer, you can put your hand up and put your microphone on and ask your question in person. So as there are currently no questions in the chat, so I think if you've been waiting, listening to all of those presentations and formulating your questions, then now is your time to start typing or put your hand up. But maybe while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions or start typing, I could come back to Alistair. And Alistair, maybe, oh, sorry, I'm not coming back to you, Alistair. I'm not going to put you on the spot. Tele has his hand up. Tele, would you like to turn your microphone on and ask your question?
Okay, thank you, Louise. Firstly, I'd just like to congratulate Alistair, Jane, Barbara, and others for your presentation. I really welcome, I look forward to reading the book. For me, the key themes that were presented kind of a bit of a deja vu experience for me in terms of my areas of interest over the years. And I think perhaps certain themes need to be updated in terms of the social media, the use of artificial intelligence, as we've now discovered. They reproduce this racist and sexist practice. So that's one thing for me. The other is to do with really the last two presentations regarding education for social justice and work with students. I am very minded, Louise, when a comment you made, which has really got me thinking, particularly in my new role as program leader for PhD in health and social care, in which you said that we assess too much at London Met. Do you recall making that comment? Uh,
Well,
uh,
I think that might have been something I said in an unguarded moment, Telly. I didn't think you were going to trot it out in the middle of a
no,
discussion.
no, but it's because I actually felt that in terms of, if we to consider it in light of education for social justice, and in terms of helping to raise students' attainment level, and this notion of, I suppose, critical question for me is that I feel we need to seriously examine that in light of Digby and Jan's presentation, and the contradiction for me in education for social justice and trying to uh, uh, move on the league table of NSS. How do we address that? Which for me is, in a way, kind of contradicts everything else that's been presented, particularly Paul's presentation. It's as if we are well embedded in the neoliberal agenda of when we're talking about student engagement and experience, which is actually is about trying to move up the league table. Any comment?
Thank you, Telly. That was a very detailed question, and I think there's a lot there that maybe people could pick up on. Maybe because there are other questions building up now, could I ask maybe Alistair to respond, perhaps in the first instance, to that question? It's a very provocative question that Telly is posing.
Sure. I think that's one of the dilemmas that we all face, is that we're embedded in the system that is a marketized system, where there are pressures both from outside, but also pressures from within to continue in the way that's been the past. It's performativity that we're expected to engage in, which is simply, if you reduce it to reproducing what's gone before. And it doesn't pay much attention to the way in which society itself is changing and technology is changing, as was just said. And we need to find some dynamic that allows us to change that. That has to come from within, but also has to recognize what's going on outside. I think that there are two things to do. One is to actually change practice within the educational system, whatever it is, whether it's a primary school or a university, to take note of the individual and the individuals concerned in it, and to recognize them and to value them in a way that's not been the way of the past. So we don't treat them as simply receptacles for knowledge that's being passed on, but take note of their own learning potential and their own learning interests. And secondly, we need to engage much more, I think, with society at large to show that there has to be change. It's not simply has to be change on the environmental aspects, but there has to be change in the societal aspects, in the way in which we think about what education is about in the new world we're moving into. It's no longer, as Go would say, getting the facts right first. The facts are changing. The way we get the facts are changing, and we don't need to get the facts in the old ways. It must be like the system when Caxton was first around and introducing the printed word, and meeting resistance from the scribes whose jobs were being put at risk. We no longer need to have that system, or we no longer need to be stuck with the old ways, and we need to engage with policymakers much more. And I think there is a receptivity possible there. I mean, we've found in the work that we've been doing that we're being commissioned work very much for public bodies, but they were alert and interested in and wanted to include aspects of social justice and inclusion in their work, if it could be in the work they were commissioning, if it could be done. So you have to take the opportunities that you got to seize on them and to actually inject into them what our mission is, what our agenda is, So I'm just give a very simple example. Years ago, we were asked to look at teacher supply in London, and that's interesting in its own right, useful in its own right to get teacher supply change. But in the process of doing that, we flagged up very strongly the ethnic composition of the teaching force at the time and said, this won't do. And there was a receptivity to that, and it was taken on board. And very slowly, changes were made that actually attempted to balance the ethnic balance of the teacher workforce. And it has actually changed a lot over the past 20 years. So you can get in there and do things. Sorry, I was talking
Thank you, Alistair. Oh, sorry to talk across you. There's a question in the chat, and I can see that Sky also has a hand up. So maybe we'll take the question in the chat first, but if I could ask for a relatively brief answer, please. So this is from Lorna Mundy. I would love to hear more about co-creating partnerships with students, for example, in terms of challenging our current neoliberal context. So I don't know who'd like to answer that. Alistair, maybe you could nominate one of the authors who might be in a position to talk about co-creation and partnerships with students. Alistair, you're on mute. The first time I've had to say that this evening, somebody is on mute.
Barbara, would you like to go at that?
Barbara, can you hear us? We're referring to the question in the chat from Lorna. Can you see that? We may have lost Barbara.
Hi.
Oh, here she is. Hi, Barbara.
I'm so sorry. I can't find the chat.
Oh, okay. So what you need to do is you need to click on the purple button in the far corner.
Yes.
Open that, then click on the bubble, and you'll see the chat.
Right. Okay. Yes. No. I think that's a lovely question, and I think there's a lot of work that we can and must do to involve students. For example, one of the things that Carol and I have talked about in our chapter, and that we're really concerned about, is, as I said, the real sort of rise in sort of far-right populist anti-intellectual discourses, and I think it's really good to keep having those discussions with students about how they feel about those discourses, being current students, and how we and what's underpinning all these ideas and how we can perhaps change them. And that's something that I've actually do in a higher education module that I have with students, where we juxtapose the NUS and their position on so-called no platforming and the sort of things that get critiqued by the Daily Mail and so on, and we juxtapose that with an alternative perspective, and then try and debate those issues, and and what we should do at university. And I think we always have to pass it back to the students to discuss, whether it's at HE or whatever educational level we're involved in. But I'll pass it back on to. But I love that as a focus. That's a really important, I think.
Thank you, Barbara. Sky, you have your hand up. Would you like to turn your mic on and ask your question?
Oh, hello. Thanks for allowing me to ask my question. My thoughts relate to Paul Down's talk. He mentioned othering, and I just wondered, can othering relate to otherness and artists with dyslexia and the sublime? Through my research, I found commonalities of otherness in dyslexia and areas of art such as the sublime. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Sky. Paul, I don't know if you can hear us still. Maybe, Paul, you could turn your microphone on.
I don't know if you can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, would you like to pick up on Sky's question?
I've developed the notions in terms of space and relational space again, and how the internalization of self and other can be constructed in different ways. So some of my work linked with Schopenhauer was a debate that Nietzsche, engaged with Schopenhauer, obviously posthumously, with Schopenhauer, that Nietzsche would have denied the capacity even for compassion in engaging with others. He would see this as just doubling up egoism. So my argument would be that Nietzsche was in a diametric space of assumed separation and splitting in the internalization between self and other. It links in with Alistair's own chapter on identities based on separation. And so my argument was that Schopenhauer had actually intuited a different type of relational space between self and other, which wasn't this alienating othering, but was another conception of assumed connection between self and other, where the other is an extension of yourself in some way. So concentric space I've explored as being a different type of engagement with the other as assumed connection to yourself. I would also link that to the previous question in terms of co-construction and education. One of my roles at university is preparing students for working in areas of high poverty and schools. And a key point I'd argue there is not to start with the children or the students as abstract other. So that's very much about getting them to know the children, the communities in lived experience, and then reflecting on that. But the more that you kind of abstract from those communities and abstract from the children, it generates a fear, a condescension, and a misunderstanding. That's obviously quite distinct, obviously, from the access to higher education and access to the teaching profession issue, which I know Alistair has talked about before at European Commission.
Thank you very much, Paul. Skye, I hope that's answered your question. I'm sure it has. We've got another. No, we don't have another question. Would anybody else in the remaining minutes like to put their hand up and ask their question? Meanwhile, I would just like to call your attention to the chat where Anna, our colleague from the research office, is entering details about the next events. I'll just briefly mention those while you think of any remaining questions. We've got 2 events coming up next week. One is on anti-racism, a British tradition. That's an online seminar which will take place on the 20th of October. And also on the 20th of October, we are having our first research centre physical event, actually getting together at the Aldgate campus to launch a piece of research that I was involved in. This is a report on LGBTQI+ communities in Lambeth in the context of the pandemic. We'll be launching the report, and we'll also have a photographic exhibition. So if you'd like to come along to that, that is a real in-person event, not an online event. So those are 2 events coming up. All other details about the research seminars programme of events are available on our website, and the details have been posted in the chat by Anna. Right, while I was doing that commercial for the research centre activities, Jonathan has put his hand up. Jonathan, in the remaining couple of minutes, can I ask you to ask your question, please?
Oh yeah, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I hope it's not too provocative a question, but so just about access, and I just noticed that there's been a discount code popped into the chat, but the book itself is an expensive thing to buy. If we are looking at access, is there something around this where books like this and research coming out of this is made accessible to all those who may need it? And actually, I know it might sound quite a provocative thing to say, asking this sort of within this, but if the book is at £100, are we by factor that restricting those from accessing this information?
Thank you, Jonathan. Alistair has typed that there's a 20% discount, and there is a code. I don't know if the book is going to be made available as an e-book, if there are plans. Perhaps if Eunice is still here, the series editor, he can pick up on that. Eunice, I don't know if you can still hear us.
Hi.
Hi,
Yes, I
Eunice.
can hear you. Yes.
Could you say something about accessibility and whether the plans are to make the book available in a cheaper paperback or as in a more affordable e-book in due course? E-book, I mean.
Yes, there's an e-book option, but I will also talk to the editor of the Springer about the reducing the price for the students and teachers. I will do that in the soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Eunice. Right, well, there are no more questions, so it falls upon me to bring the event to a close. But I would like to thank you all on behalf of the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre for attending our event today. It was a great pleasure for us to host this prestigious book launch, and I will now hand back to Alistair to say a few closing words. Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you. Thank you, Louise. Thank you all for your useful, interesting questions. Reflecting on those will take some time. Just to say, I think the philosophy that drives many of us is not simply to research and to investigate the world, but to try and change it in some way, to make a difference in some way. And I think that the work that people are describing in the book has been concerned with that, to actually affect some kind of social change in the practices of education, and not simply to examine it and pontificate about it. Thank you all very much. I do appreciate that it's an expensive book. I'm sorry about that. I get no royalties. The contributors get no royalties, I'm afraid. So we are bound by the logic of the market, and I'm sorry about that. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. And there's lots of lovely messages in the chat as well. So if you have a chance to look at all the congratulations and the nice messages in the chat as well before you log off. So thank you all very much. And a big thank you again to Anna from the Research Office, who's doing sterling work in the background, typing in all the various links as well. So thank you all. It's been a very, very good program. Lots of really thought-provoking presentations. And again, congratulations to Alistair and your colleagues for such an informative and indeed challenging book that really forces us to think about what kind of education do we need and do we want in the 21st century. So thank you all very much for coming, and I wish you all a good evening.